estamos online também, já no nosso canal do YouTube. Já temos aqui, o pessoal já está entrando aqui no auditório. Então, eu vou, mais ou menos, como vai funcionar aqui a dinâmica. Eu vou fazer a introdução da professora, a apresentação. E aí, depois, a gente vai virar a câmera também um pouco para o público, também para não ficar só olhando para mim. E aí, depois eu faço a apresentação, e aí a professora tem 50 minutos para fazer a sua exposição, e aí teremos mais 10 minutos, 15 minutos para fazer algumas questões.
Tá ótimo.
Também teremos questões, especialmente aqui do auditório, e se for o caso, questões no YouTube, também aí a gente passa essas questões para a professora responder. Então, vamos então dar início, né, com muito prazer, do início ao colóquio internacional Claude Lefort, né, em prestígio ao centenário do filósofo. É um evento muito importante para a gente aqui na UFMG, é um autor muito importante para o departamento de filosofia, né, para a nossa linha de ética, de ética e filosofia política, e com muito prazer e muita honra que recebemos a nossa primeira convidada, a professora Claudia Hilb, da Universidade de Buenos Aires, que vai nos prestigiar com a sua conferência, que terá o título, né, livremente traduzido para o português, Claude Lefort sobre a servidão voluntária ou a reversão da liberdade em servidão. A professora Claudia Hilb possui doutorado em Ciências Sociais pela Universidade de Buenos Aires, é professora de Teoria Política na mesma universidade e pesquisadora do CONICET. Suas áreas de interesse são a teoria política do século XX, em particular a obra de Léo Strauss, Hannah Arendt e, claro, Claude Lefort. E a reflexão é teoricamente informada sobre o passado político recente na Argentina, especialmente a relação entre política e violência. A professora Claudia Hilb publicou, entre outros livros, Léo Strauss, A Arte de Ler, em 2005, o livro Usos do Passado, o que fazemos hoje com os anos 70, em 2013, o livro Abismos da Modernidade, Reflexões em torno de Hannah Arendt, Claude Lefort e Léo Strauss, 2016, e Por que os anos 70 não passam, publicado em 2018. A professora Claudia Hilb, muito obrigado por aceitar o nosso convite, e a palavra está com você. Quando estiver pronta, estamos muito ansiosos para ouvir a sua conferência. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada. And now I continue in English because, as I told you, I think that an English spoken, but by a non-native English speaker is easier to understand than an Argentinian speaker speaking very quickly in Spanish. So I would like to begin by thanking the organizer of this colloquium in the honor of Claude Lefort for inviting me to take part in it. Claude Lefort has been an absolutely fundamental figure in my studies, in my learning, in my whole career. So I am really very thankful and thrilled to be here. So now, as you may have seen, if you took a look at the title of this talk, I would like to examine how the encounter with the idea of voluntary servitude by Etienne de la Boétie has nourished Claude Lefort's reflections on attachment to totalitarianism. To do this, let me start with what Lefort himself says in Écrire. I had come across the idea of voluntary servitude in my work on ideology and totalitarianism, and discovering La Boétie, I was struck by its association with an attraction to the body of the tyrant, or more generally of the king, the master in whom the fiction of the social body was embodied, and no less struck to see it combined with the idea of a charm emanating from the name of one, which delivers subjects from the fear of division, from the ordeal of the plural, and finally, from the enigma of the human institution of society. In short, what I had long been trying to formulate when examining the totalitarian phantasm, I had found an extraordinary anticipation of in La Boétie. End of quote. attraction to the body of the master, incarnation of the fiction of the social body, fear of division and the plural, deliverance from the enigma of the human institution of the social. We here find, as you see, the coordinates of Lefortian meditation on the attraction of totalitarianism, which will, from then on, be enriched by the notion of voluntary servitude. For Lefort, this means returning to the question of submission to totalitarian regimes and parties, a submission which cannot simply be put down to coercion, but must be questioned as an effort to escape uncertainty and to find in the image of a body, of a society, one welded to a head, the deliverance from the fear of division, from the fantasy of dissolution. I will begin with a brief look at Lefort's reading of La Boétie's Discours in 1976 to draw out some of the elements that I believe help to flesh out his thoughts on the subject. I will then look at the reappearance of certain expressions, voluntary servitude, the reversal of the desire for freedom into the desire for servitude, in Lefort's later texts, to finally explore how these pave the way for us to consider different figures or modes of the reversal of freedom into servitude in Lefort's works. So, to start with, some landmarks of the Lefortian reading of La Boétie. I certainly cannot go into Lefort's complex reading of La Boétie's work here, so I merely propose to highlight or to enumerate a few aspects, a few landmarks that I believe to be crucial for my purpose. So first, Lefort focuses on the inconceivable, unnameable nature of the concept of voluntary servitude, which in La Boétie's words is repugnant to language. This barely pronounceable concept makes us realize, says Lefort, and I quote him, that the dominant-dominated relationship is internal to the subject if it is still possible to speak of a subject, and it calls on us to try and grasp what precisely evades the concept. Secondly, Lefort shows us that La Boétie is not dealing with a choice between two desires, desire for freedom and desire for servitude, which will relieve us of the weight of the enigma, but is dealing with a free choice of servitude, in other words, a reversal of freedom into servitude, of the desire for freedom into the desire for servitude. 3, we must not lose sight of the difference highlighted by Lefort between the desire to be and the desire to possess in La Boétie. The desire for freedom is inseparable from freedom in action, the desire to be free, to be in freedom, and not the desire to have, the desire to possess something. But although the desire for servitude may, on a first reading, appear as the desire for something, on a second reading, it emerges as the desire for servitude, the desire to be in servitude, and thus finds a disquieting proximity to the desire for freedom. 4, Lefort's reading of La Boétie also tells us that rather than lose certainty, men prefer to place their lives at the master's disposal. In the enchantment of the one, they find an imaginary antidote to the fear of dissolution. But as we grasp the attraction of fusion into the one, into the image of an undivided society with an organic identity, we are also made aware of the impossibility of its completion, that is, of its fantastic character. Otherwise stated, and this would be point 5, in La Boétie's interknowledge and friendship, Lefort identifies a way of naming the human condition of plurality as the original condition of interpersonal understanding in speech. And this leads him to assert that in La Boétie, servitude, fusion into the one, or tyranny, I quote, can never complete its work, end of quote, that it is only imaginarily realizable since it is upheld by the interdiction to, I quote again, do, to speak, quasi, to think. So, two further points which interest me especially go to the heart of my question. Are all individuals equally liable to alienate themselves in the desire for servitude? So these further points would be, the first one, the Lefortian reading of La Boétie reminds us of the difference between accomplices and friends, between those who surrender to the spell of the one and those who engage in a mutual and plural relationship, resisting the temptation to sink into an identity-based home. But it also tells us that to fully grasp the enchantment, we may need to have been through it in one way or another. To be able to hear the name of the one, we may have had to take a step backwards from what we immediately see, that is, that one dominates over many. There is no external discourse, there is no concept for voluntary servitude, no demonstration either. The threat of enchantment is embedded in language, and it only becomes visible in discourse for those who have escaped it. The call of an illusion is tenacious, and the appeal to the name, to the singular, the people, the man, threatens to bewitch even he who wishes to escape it, he who questions it. The desire for freedom, writes Lefort, arises, and I quote, from the continual refusal to yield to the attraction of form, of the identical, of the one, end of quote. This refusal is, I might say, the experience of refusal made by him or her who knows what she's talking about, not because she has the concept, but because she has the experience. Finally, and this is the second point which interests me especially, Lefort reminds us of the difference in La Boétie's text between those who, in the end, appear to be merely suffering servitude and those who have turned themselves into links in the chain of enslavement. The ordinary people, on one hand, who seem to be fooled by the carriage of a feather, who remain stupid before the toe of Pyrrhus, and the petty tyrants, who, I quote, throw themselves into the fire, who take an active part in perpetuating tyranny, end of quote, excuse me, and for whom the drive for servitude lies more clearly in a desire for possession, gain, property, or power, and overall, in Lefort's word, in the desire in each one to identify with the tyrant by making oneself the master of another. End of quote. An argument concerning the servitude of each and every one of us thus crosses paths with what we might call a Machiavellian argument opposing two desires, the one of the people and the one of the grandis. La Boétie, writes Lefort, and I quote again, ultimately recognizes a division between those who merely reenact the figure of the prince from petty tyrant to petty tyrant, tyranno, and those who only endure. A great division between a high and a low, between a hierarchy wherein power is transmitted through a chain of identifications and the little people who endure. La Boétie, continues Lefort, is therefore keenly aware of the fact that social division persists. So, excuse me, I'm a little bit in a cold. I might cough from time to time. So, let's now widen our gaze to the Lefortian reading of totalitarianism and look at the reappearance of La Boétian elements in the text following the 1976 essay by Lefort, with a view to deepening his reflection on domination from within, that is, an obedience that cannot be reduced to coercion, and in particular, on the reversion of the desire for freedom into the desire for servitude. Let's return to the inconceivable, unspeakable nature of the notion of voluntary servitude. Lefort's approach is not based on a concept, as I said, It is rather based on a narrative that puts us face to face with the inconceivable. Through literature, as in his reading of Orwell's 1984, or through Solzhenitsyn's literary testimony, as in Un homme en trop. Only an individual, writes Lefort, through his or her own experience, can restore to us what eludes conceptualization. Or also through some reading of the authors who are among what he calls his heroes, Tocqueville, Quinet. In this way, I would say, in a sort of oblique manner, Lefort brings us into contact with this phenomenon that, as I quoted before, language refuses to name. Voluntary servitude eludes concept. We can't expect it to be demonstrated. We capture it in stories, in the writings of others, but to do so, we must also have somehow been there, experienced it, and who knows, felt its attraction. This we saw was already said in Lefort's reading of La Boétie, but Lefort will also say this of himself in a dialogue with Habib Mouchard Paché and Manon, reproduced in Le Temps Présent. I quote Lefort, "If I had not myself been caught up in the belief in another society, if I were not in a more general way inhabited by the beliefs that enslave me, the notion of voluntary servitude would perhaps remain foreign to me." End of quote. Likewise, reporting on Solzhenitsyn's account of the revolt in a camp, of the recovery of speech and the ensuing experience of freedom, Lefort quotes Solzhenitsyn, "Who has not had the experience of this change cannot imagine it." And in La Croyance en Politique, Lefort goes on to say that, and I quote again, "The question posed by servitude only makes sense to those who have the experience of freedom." So that voluntary servitude eludes concept, that it becomes sensible only to those who experience it, who have made the experience of freedom, but also the experience of not giving in to the attraction of voluntary servitude, that it is not open to demonstration. All this certainly doesn't mean that those who are sensitive to its enigma have nothing to say about it. Quite the contrary, in fact. If the desire to know is, according to Lefort, immediately the desire to be free, our effort to understand is immediately the desire to persist in our desire for freedom as freedom in action. Lefort's work is pervaded by the close association of the desire for knowledge and freedom, of speech and freedom, of a desire for knowledge that is always also desire in act, undetermined, incomplete, and inextricable from our plural condition. We can follow the traces of this association in his reading of La Boétie's Entre connaissances, as well as in the attention Lefort pays to the opposite desire not to think, as it appears in Quinet or in Solzhenitsyn's Un homme en trop. We'll come back to this. Freedom, plurality, speech, the desire to know are all ways of pointing to the condition of indeterminacy which inhabits us, which cannot be abolished, but only denied in the fantasy of the one and the desire for servitude. In reading La Boétie through Lefort, we learn that freedom in its free exercise can turn into servitude. And we have also learned that although on first reading the desire for servitude appears to us as a desire for something, a closer look reveals it too as a desire to be, rather than a desire to have, a desire to be in servitude, which is ready to renounce the very goods we would have thought in the first instance it was pursuing in its desire to submit to the one, to the master. Now, how are we to describe what is thus desired in the desire for servitude? How are we to confront the enigma of renunciation, of the reversal of the desire for freedom into the desire for servitude? How are we to think of this relinquishment of this desire of freedom, which at the same time always seems capable of resurfacing in the coming together of men and women, as it does in the improbable revolt in the camps related by Solzhenitsyn? In the pairs that run through Lefort's work, and in his reading of the authors dear to him, Friendship and Complicity in La Boétie, the desire not to think and the heroism of the spirit in Quinet, the desire to dominate and the desire not to be dominated in Machiavelli, plurality and unity, all ones and all one, we find time after time the affirmation of freedom, but also the enigma of its loss. So the question would be, what do we desire in the desire for servitude if it is not a possession, if it is not something? This is expressed in many ways in Lefort's reference to La Boétie, which I quoted right at the beginning. It is also described by Lefort as laughing subjection to the prince, in reference to La Boétie, as the search for certainty in Guizot, as idolatry or love in Michelet, or by Lefort in himself, in formulations that echo the preceding ones: liberation of subjects from the fear of division, desire for indivision, search for an infallible authority, and again, I quote, an inordinate demand for belief, or better said, a desire for certainty about the substance and being of society, a blinding desire, end of quote. In the enchantment of the one, this desire seems to have found an answer to the unbearable character of uncertainty and division. In this way, a belief is affirmed, expressed in the word of a master, a person or a theory, Lefort would say, echoing Quinet, who thinks for all. Returning a few years later to La Boétie, Lefort writes that, I quote, the charm of the name of one by itself gives men the feeling of being together, absolutely named. The enchantment in the name of the one appears as the counterpart of the blinding desire to achieve unity, to escape uncertainty. But as we have already said, this desire is in Lefort's eyes unattainable. Indeterminacy, writes Lefort, I quote, cannot be abolished but only denied. It only vanishes apparently in what we must call fantasy, end of quote. Phantasm, fantasy, imaginary unity, illusion, denial, under various names, Lefort will refer to the unattainable, elusive character of such a desire which in the totalitarian utopia will pursue the illusion of the abolition of division, of the refusal of difference. In his discourse, says Lefort, La Boétie already sketches out an analysis of fantasy that brings Freud to mind. While it is true that Lefort doesn't seem to find much interest in specifying his use of the terms symbolic and imaginary, and even occasionally denies the paternity of psychoanalysis with regard to the symbolic, his uses of the terms imaginary, symbolic, and real clearly retains a familiarity with psychoanalytic usage from Freud to Lacan. And the evidence gathered throughout his works suggests that the terms fantasy, with an F or with PH, fiction or imaginary, always frame the description of an illusion, the illusion of leaping over the fear of division, over the challenge of the human condition of plurality, or to put in other words, in the words of Lefort, over the enigma of the human institution of the social. In this sense, it is possible to affirm that, seen in this light, totalitarianism is a sham. Totalitarianism is a fraud, insofar as it claims to exempt man from the test of truth as it proposes to free men from their relationship to justice, to the law, by fixing these in an instance or in a place that escapes this very relationship. And this by raising a figure that embodies, materializes unity, the illusion of society's correspondence with itself, in the image that condenses both division, the radically other, and indivision, the one as materialization of the community's unity. So I now return to the question. I haven't forgot it. What do we desire in the desire for servitude? If, according to Lefort, in a first reading of La Boétie, this desire could be desire to possess, a desire for something, in a second moment, and this is the one Lefort is most interested in, this desire is seen as a desire without a material object. In this, it reveals itself both in its proximity to the desire for freedom, desire to be in servitude, desire without an object, and as its inversion. In the text that followed his reading of La Boétie, Lefort returned to this reversal on several occasions. The question, he asserts, can be posed as follows, and I quote, "Is not the desire for servitude like the desire for freedom, but reversed?" End of quote. The desire for servitude is no longer a desire that, as the desire for freedom, opens toward an outside, a desire that by its very definition cannot find satisfaction. The desire for servitude, this desire, we read, comes to imaginarily close itself off or turn in on itself, enclosing the desire of the other, and thus becomes a desire for servitude. Excuse me, the desire for freedom comes to imaginarily close itself off or turn in on itself, enclosing the desire of the other, and thus becomes a desire for servitude. But it is certainly not enough to list quotations from Lefort to be able to claim that we understand what we are talking about, or that we are touching on something true here. What we want to understand is precisely how and by what means the desire for freedom can turn on and against itself. Once again, we shouldn't expect Lefort to come up with a conceptualization that would solve the enigma for us by more geometrico. But we can, in exchange, try to follow the path of the enigma Lefort himself is trying to circumscribe. So let's put the question once again in new terms. What are we to understand? What can be heard in the statement that the desire for freedom turns into the desire for servitude? Let's begin by restating the political nature of Lefort's question. What we need to grasp, as we said at the outset, are the ways in which totalitarianism can represent a reply, an imaginary, fantastic reply, to democratic modernity. The Lefortian reading of La Boétie, but also of Guizot, Michelet, Tocqueville, and Quinet, as well as Orwell and Solzhenitsyn, is constantly permeated by this question. So let me take it up again. To desire freedom is to be free. We are free through the challenge of the exercise of thinking, of speaking, of creating, in which and through which meaning arises, for which there is no external warranty other than the very exercise of carrying it out. I quote Lefort, and all Lefortians know this quote by heart. Modern society and the modern individual are instituted in the challenge of a dissolution of the ultimate landmarks of certainty. Under the effect of this, an adventure is opened up, constantly threatened by the resistance it arouses, in which the foundations of power, the foundations of law, the foundations of knowledge are called into question. An adventure constantly threatened. Totalitarianism, to repeat, puts an end to the experience of indeterminacy, the adventure in which the search for identity cannot free itself from the experience of division. The desire for servitude can be best described as the desire to escape uncertainty, the fear of division, the challenge of plurality, the desire not to think the desire to melt into the all one, which takes the form of enchantment, idolatry, love, subsumption in the body of the master, the leader, the image of a unified society incarnated in a body whose head thinks for all and names the whole. But Lefort, we know, underlines not only what totalitarianism reverses, what is shown to be unbearable in indeterminacy. Lefort also insists on what, in this reversion, totalitarianism will be prolonging, admittedly in phantasmatic form, the illusion of a full intelligibility of society, the illusion according to which life in common can be organized in a comprehensive way. The image of a homogeneous space offered up to the knowledge of an anonymous state, which projects the image of a people, and which will find a phantasmatic actualization in the form of the image of the people one, a homogeneous whole, and an omniscient master. Totalitarianism is an anti-democratic revolution in that it is a revolution against uncertainty, against indeterminacy, against society's distance with itself. At the same time, it is also the phantasmatic extension of the illusory intelligibility of the social from within the social itself, an illusion of intelligibility which haunts a regime that has destituted the figure of otherness, that has deprived the pole of transcendence of the substance of a body or of a figure. The reversion of freedom into servitude manifests the refusal of indeterminacy, the fear of uncertainty, and this part of the illusion, the phantasmatic prolongation of the possible intelligibility of the social totality that finds its most complete political expression in modern totalitarianism. This reversion, and here I finally come to the heart of the matter, can be read from different angles in Lefort's text, which take up in more or less direct terms, but always in a form of questioning, the enigma of voluntary servitude or the interrogation of domination from within. First of all, we can read in Lefort that the desire for freedom, freedom in action, which, as we pointed out, is exposure to contingency, to the unforeseen and the unpredictable, can, in times of great uncertainty, open the way to the desire for that something that would come to fill its gap, an immediate desire for certainty, security, a desire for servitude that delivers subjects from fear and division. The forms of coexistence between individuals which democracy opens can, under certain conditions, prove to be unbearable for some and nourish the desire for unity, for the existence of a pole from which a single fixed truth can be pronounced. At the same time, as we said, it is this very form of coexistence which, through its belief in a fully human society with a homogeneous space available for full knowledge, provides the matrix into which the totalitarian fantasy can be inserted, claiming to realize what, if it is present as an impulse in democracy, can only be present there in a latent form. The risk of reversion, of tearing apart, as Lefort would say, becomes tangible in moments of crisis when the symbolic efficacy of the democratic regime fails, when the difference between power as a symbolic instance and as a real organ, or the distinction between reference to an unoccupied place and the vacuum of power, tends to disappear, when differences of interest, opinion, and value appear as a pure dissolution of the possibility of a legitimate common order. At this point, the danger, which so frightened 19th century theorists, the danger that the destruction of old circuits of dependence could lead to atomization and the impossibility of order, or open the way to a new form of submission, becomes apparent. Democratic uncertainty faces the peril of turning into a demand for certainty. The disembodiment of power, of difference, into a phantasm of the people one, in search of a substantial identity and incarnate power, and the state freed from division. Democratic institutions, writes Lefort in a quote well known by Lefortian, are made to dispel the charm of the name of one, but they are never fully established. They only last as long as they are sustained by a desire that is always threatened with reversion. But in Lefort's reading of La Boétie, but also of Quinet, Michelet, or Tocqueville, this reversion seems, at first glance, to be articulated in the same terms for all those who are captured by the spell of the one. A second look reveals some significant distinctions. The first, and perhaps the most important, is the one we noted in the Lefortian reading of La Boétie between, I quote, those who merely reproduce the figure of the prince from tyrant to tyrant, and those who merely endure. A great division between a top and a bottom, between a hierarchy where power is transmitted through a chain of identifications, and the little power and the little people who suffer. End of quote. This distinction points to different phenomena, and excuse me, but I quote again. On the one hand, the enchantment provided by the name of one, which implies submission, and I add, which seems to affect the whole, including the little people who suffer, and I continue in the quote, and on the other, the identification from close to the one who represents this name, and the determination to imprint one's will on others, end of quote, referring here to what Lefort, along with La Boétie, would call petty tyrants, tyranno. So by introducing, as I said, as a distinction with strong Machiavellian overtones between the dominant and the dominated, Lefort clearly places the mechanism by which voluntary servitude circulates and reproduces on the side of the dominant and submission on the side of the dominated. In this perspective, the little people who suffer are also prisoners of the spell, but they are so, as we said, in the form of the fascination and innocence of those who remain stupid before the toe of Pyrrhus, this is quoted by La Boétie, and the mainspring of obedience in those who place themselves in the camp of the dominant, writes Lefort, and I quote, lies in the desire in each of them to identify with the tyrant by making themselves the master of another. From this angle, the desire for servitude of those who are part of the chain of tyrants can be seen in a new light. Although they too are victims of a marriage, the desire that drives them appears not only as fascination before the name of the one, but also, we recall, as the desire to identify with the tyrant by making oneself the master of another. And if we follow La Boétie, says Lefort, and I quote, it is the chain of tyrants that allows us to better grasp the secret of voluntary servitude. They live only in alienation. The authority, the property they believe they possess or covet, conceals from them the fact that they have lost the free disposal of their thoughts and their bodies. I believe I will not be straying too far if I try to relate this way of conceiving the desire for servitude to Lefort's questioning of the militant embracing of totalitarian regimes by those who have also often thought of themselves as champions of freedom. Of these, we can say that they are not part of the little people, and also that they live in alienation, that the authority they believe they possess or that they crave makes them blind to the fact that they have lost the free disposition of their thought. They have alienated their ability to think in the other, and as chained tyrants, they believe they think, but have lost the strength to do so. This other, the one who thinks for everyone, may be, Quinet's phrase reappears under Lefort's pen, a master or a theory. And this alienation results from an effort, a will, a desire not to think. the alienation of thought in a master or a theory, of free speech in ideological discourse or slogans, is the reversion of freedom into servitude, of the desire for freedom as freedom in act, into the desire for servitude as the desire not to think. For the party member, writes Lefort in La Complication, and I quote, not to think means wanting not to think, and this wanting results from a fundamental duty. In admitting this, we immediately discover the relationship between obedience to the law and voluntary servitude. We then return to La Boétie's subtle description, the benefits that some, and then many more, derive from their subjection. Among these benefits is the power gained by the self-righteous to set themselves up as masters of thought to the mass of ignorant or hesitant people. End of quote. But even if this development may shed some light, and some important light, I think, on the reversion of freedom into servitude that we are trying to identify, we can ask ourselves if this, the benefit obtained by tyrants, by those who wish in servitude to identify themselves with a tyrant by making themselves the master of another, in order to gain access to the power to set themselves up as maîtres à penser, if this is the only way to understand the desire for servitude of those who are not part of the little people, or is there still something that we seem to be missing? In Un homme en trop, Lefort asks precisely, and I quote, how, right here in France, could the fear of the truth have been so obstinately cultivated, the mutilation of thought so diligently practiced by most of those who populated the left, by those who nonetheless mobilized against oppression and exploitation in the capitalist world, those in particular who had not buried themselves in party loyalty and who did know what they didn't want to know? I ask, in memory of the old enigma posed by La Boétie, where does voluntary servitude take root here when there is no despot installed to satisfy it, when its substitute, the party, is not even venerated? End of quote. So where does the spring of servitude, of the reversion of the desire for freedom into its opposite, lie here? Lefort's sentence seems to suggest that the path of tyrannical desire we explored is insufficient here. No despot, no substitute for the despot here to satisfy the desire for servitude. The question would be, can submission to theory satisfy this desire? Can it be satisfied by submission to the philosophy of history, to the theory of the final struggle, of the full realization of a world reconciled with itself, a world that has overcome division? If this were so, then what might this desire, which has attracted so many men and women of the left, so many intellectuals and thinkers, consist of? I'll take up the question again. How are we to consider the reversion of the desire for freedom into a desire for servitude among thinkers and actors who can think of as striving for servitude, who we can think of as striving for servitude, while they think to be attempting to find freedom? The militant, the intellectual, the philosopher, if we accept to distinguish them from the little people who let themselves be fooled by the ethereal movement of a feather, where does the will to serve, the will not to think, the will to adhere to a master or a theory dwell in them? To conclude, I'd like to suggest 3 possible ways of pursuing this line of questioning. The first takes up, in a slightly modified terms, the argument of the revulsive character of democratic uncertainty I was referring to earlier. In Permanence du théologico-politique, after once again describing the way in which totalitarianism takes shape in the denial of social division as the recomposition of a body for society, Lefort writes, and I quote, "The commitment of many philosophers in our time, and not the least, Sartre is surely in his mind. The commitment of many philosophers in our time, and not the least the adventures of Nazism, fascism, or communism, finds its reason in this. The attachment to religion we mentioned encloses them in the illusion of a restoration of unity and identity as such, which they foresee announcing itself in the union of the social body. It is not submission to a charismatic authority that leads them to adhere to a totalitarian regime, and all the less so when they rally to communism. They give in to the attraction of a rediscovered certainty under the guise of which they paradoxically secure a right to think freely, the foundations of all experience of the world. End of quote. It is therefore not primarily the enchantment with the master's word, but rather their attachment to the religious that seems to deprive the thinkers of grasping the liberating dimension of democratic uncertainty, which deprives them of understanding it as anything other than a dissolution or a surrender of a normative dimension, which then leads them to seek or to find in the illusion of unity a form of society that has monstrously incorporated within itself the figure of that one who is at once the all other and most fully the same. For the thinker caught up in the attachment to the religious, or should we say, the attraction of the theological political, the answer to what he can only perceive as a rallying to the state of things or a renouncement of the realization of meaning seems to offer itself in the form of the totalitarian matrix. Those who have embraced totalitarianism, more particularly communist totalitarianism, seem to have given in to the illusion of a political form in which knowledge and law are subsumed under the pole of power, and thus freed from indeterminacy, they embrace a newfound certainty in the shelter of which they believe they can think freely. The second indication is based on the Lefortian reading of 1984. Captured and tortured by O'Brien, Winston, writes Lefort, I quote, will come in the course of his interrogation to prefer the certainty of what is, the certainty that the other, even if for his loss, shares his thought. End of quote. Unlike what had happened, he was in rebellion against the regime, Winston will prefer the communion of thought with O'Brien rather than certainty of his own thinking on what is. He gives up his own judgment to melt into the judgment of his dominator. It's his choice, his preference, right, Lefort, his desire to think, his desire to be free, has changed into a desire to be at one with his dominator, into the desire not to think for himself. Lefort's description reminds the reader of the paragraphs on the Moscow trials in Un homme en trop. It seems more unbearable to give up the certainty of sharing one's thought with the other, or rather with the other with a big O, than to give up thinking for oneself. The other, who in 1984 appeared represented by O'Brien, who both provokes fear but also protects against it, and who for the communists of the Moscow trials is represented by certainty, the truth of the revolution, of the redemption of history, embodied in the party which they neither want nor can renounce. Finally, a third and last way of thinking about this reversion of the desire for freedom into the desire for certainty takes up a suggestion made by my colleague Alain Mahé in his lengthy commentary on Lefort's study of La Boétie. This suggestion overlaps independently and coincidentally with an interrogation that I tried to develop without thinking of either Lefort or La Boétie in my consideration of the commitment of part of the revolutionary left in Argentina to the of violence even under democracy. In his study, Mahé suggests that we could complete the Lefortian reading of the reversal of the desire for freedom into the desire for servitude by adding a stage to the argument which would enable us to better understand in relation to what and how this reversal takes place. And that this stage could consist in what in a language certainly familiar to La Boétie, the legal theology thought of as delectatio morosa, that is the pleasure bound up with desire that makes us indulge in desire, that makes us desire itself, It's repetition and perpetuation. In this way, suggests Maé, we could imagine that we are no longer driven to desire freedom in its very exercise, but rather that we redouble this pleasure, that we are driven to desire the perpetration of the pleasure we enjoy and in the exercise of freedom, and that this freedom thus takes the form of an object that provides us with pleasure. And that thus, in this way, no longer by the pleasure immediately procured by freedom, by the desire for freedom, but by that of consent to desire, we would pave the way to servitude. To consent to the desire for servitude, if this can be described as the desire to possess freedom as an object. It was, and I finish in 2 minutes, as I said, in a very similar sense, that several years ago, I tried to question the conditions under which the desire for freedom finds its place in revolutionary organization and the ways in which this desire for freedom gives way to what I can now, with Lefort, call the desire not to think as the annihilation of plurality and singularity in the one who is obeyed without possible hesitation. I had begun to wonder whether the path to the mutation of the desire could perhaps pass through the mutation of the desire to be free into the desire to perpetuate freedom, whether it could perhaps pass through the mutation of the pleasure felt in free action into the desire to perpetuate the possibility of experiencing this pleasure, and thus into the desire to possess freedom, which procures this pleasure as an object. Here too, the question arises as to whether it is possible to think of reversion, not in terms of immediate fascination with the charm of the one, but through an instance of the desire to perpetuate the feeling provided by free action, agitatio morosa, and that it would be this instant that would lead to entrust the safeguarding of this desire to an organization, a party, a leader, raised up as a guarantee of the possibility of perpetuating the desire experienced in action. In this way, where freedom in action becomes an object of pleasure, the continued possession of which must be guaranteed at all costs, freedom would reverse itself into servitude, entrusting our desire to an organization or a leader. We might in time even prefer to give up life rather than to be exposed to uncertainty or to the loss of the pleasure provided by action. Now, to conclude, really, let me recall this quotation from Lefort, which I already quoted. If I myself had not been inhabited by the belief that enslaved me, the notion of voluntary servitude would perhaps remain foreign to me. End of quote. Exactly how far is the communist militant or sympathizer from the tyrant? Do they always coincide? Do they continue to do so when, as was the case for Bukharin, Zinoviev, and so many others, the militant is condemned to embody the figure of the enemy without, however, being able to escape the enchantment? What is it that allows such an activist to regain his voice in certain circumstances and such another to resist the spell? What is it that suddenly causes the enchantment to break and the king, the one, to appear in all his nakedness? Perhaps, who knows, we might find the clue in the biography of dissidents from communist regimes, from the Soviet Union to Cuba, from the former East Germany to China. Yes, to experience the charm, you have to be freed of it. It might be that in the experience of this liberation, which eludes concept and cannot be demonstrated, there could lie one possible way of approaching the enigma. Thank you very much.
Tem uma pergunta que a gente vai começar falando.
Professora Cláudia, muito obrigado. Adoramos a sua conferência. Vamos abrir agora para as questões. Temos questão no YouTube, temos questões aqui na plateia. Vamos começar aqui pelo auditório e depois fazemos a questão do YouTube. Pode ser?
Sí, sí, pode ser. I don't know if I can hear very well, but I hope I do the question from the auditory.
Ok.
Gente, o microfone tem uma baixa.
No, but we can try. We can try. I can take questions in Portuguese or in English or whatever you want.
Ok.
Se fala devagar.
Bem. Então, o convidado, a pessoa vem aqui, faz a pergunta e aí acho que o som fica melhor.
Ok.
I don't like speak English, especially in Brazil. So I will make my question in Portuguese. So,
Ok.
Professora, muito obrigado pela sua fala.
Fala devagar, sim? Fala devagar.
Muito obrigado pela sua fala. Okay. Eu acho um erro muito comum, na perspectiva da análise do totalitarismo, igualar os regimes, igualar os desejos. A Revolução Bolchevique não foi, de forma nenhuma, a mesma forma de desejo de liberdade, nem o desejo de servidão, que a gente pode compreender o nazismo, por exemplo. Né? Eu acredito que a gente tem que ter muita cautela, e eu acredito que é um erro que a Hannah Arendt faz nas origens do totalitarismo, que a gente não pode replicar. Né? Eu gostaria que você refletisse um pouco, para nós agora, sobre a especificidade do desejo da Revolução Bolchevique de 1917. Como que a gente compreende essa mutação específica do modo como a Revolução Bolchevique se deu, diferenciando claramente, se é possível, se é a sua concepção, diferenciando do desejo de dominação nazista. Muito obrigado. Você me entendeu bem?
Sí, sí, entendí bien. I'm sorry, do you want me to answer in English or in Spanish? What is better?
Pode ser em espanhol. Espanhol.
Ok, mejor para mí y falo devagar también. En primer lugar, creo que sería más una pregunta para el propio Claude Lefort que para mí. Claramente, así como para Hannah Arendt, el tema esencial de sus orígenes del totalitarismo es el totalitarismo nazi, con el que ella está lidiando, para Claude Lefort yo no tengo ninguna duda que el tema esencial para pensar desde los años 40 en adelante es qué sucede con el régimen de la Unión Soviética. Y todo su desarrollo teórico está teórico y práctico, porque Lefort es muy difícil de separar lo que es su desarrollo teórico de lo que es la intervención política. Está centrada en lo que él entiende es el totalitarismo soviético. Y de hecho, en las últimas 3 modulaciones que yo intenté hacer sobre la reversión del deseo de libertad en deseo de servidumbre, si bien no están presentes así de este modo en Lefort, si bien yo las rescato del texto de Lefort cuando me pongo a pensar en este tema, claramente están orientadas a regímenes que tienen mucho más que ver, bueno, tal vez es algo 1984, pero en el caso de las preguntas que se hacen Lefort en la complicación, claramente tiene que ver con qué pasó con los intelectuales de izquierda que apoyaron, defendieron un régimen que, a ojos de Lefort, es un régimen de dominación totalitaria. Entonces, no sé muy bien cómo responder a la pregunta, porque creo que es Lefort el que debería responderla, pero sí no tengo ninguna duda que en el caso de Lefort, cuando él piensa esto, lo piensa desde los años 40, lo piensa en sus lecturas críticas de Merleau-Ponty, de Humanismo y Terror, lo piensa en su acercamiento a las aventures de la dialéctique, y lo piensa en toda su obra personal, claramente en ese registro. No sé si la respuesta es satisfactoria.
Muito bem. Mais alguma pergunta do auditório? Se passar a pergunta talvez pelo chat, você copia e cola. Professora, vamos colocar a pergunta do YouTube aí no chat do Google, talvez até seja mais fácil para a professora acessar essa questão.
A ver si puedo, espera, me está costando. No estoy encontrando dónde...
No chat do Google.
Ah, acá está, sí. ¿Es una pregunta tuya, Fernando?
No, es una pregunta
In discussing the work of Hannah Arendt, excuse me, I'll read it out loud. In discussing the work of Hannah Arendt, Judith Clark suggested the distinction. Yeah, okay. This would again be a question posed to Hannah Arendt rather than to me. And I wouldn't, perdón, sigo en castellano. No me atrevería a discutir con Judith Clark así, de repente. Yo debo decir que respecto a Hannah Arendt, yo soy una gran admiradora de la obra de Arendt, pero sobre todo, mucho más que en la definición conceptual, yo soy una gran admiradora, yo diría, del modo de pensar de Arendt. Y en ese modo de pensar en el que efectivamente para mí está muy emparentada con el modo de pensar de Claude Lefort, eso que Arendt llama thinking without banisters. Luego, sobre la diferencia categorial entre totalitarismo y autoritarismo, tal vez tenga razón Schlar, pero nuevamente, o sea, tendría que entrar en otro tema que tendría que pensar mucho más y al cual deveria responder Arendt.
Muito bem, obrigado. Professora, eu não resisto a lhe fazer essa pergunta, né, que é, a partir, né, dessa leitura de Lefort, que Lefort faz de Boétie, a conferência que a professora nos apresentou hoje, o que a professora retira, né, de escritos dessa análise que Lefort faz de Boétie para pensar a Argentina hoje e o fenômeno Milei? A professora vê, né, nesse tipo de ideias que Lefort, né, nos aporta, são ideias que nos servem hoje para pensar, né, o fenômeno Milei, por exemplo?
Es una pregunta difícil y es una pregunta que me he hecho, y supongo que ustedes también se la han hecho con Bolsonaro y que nos la hacemos con Trump o con Meloni, con este tipo de regímenes. A ver, yo tengo bastante resistencia a pensar que, bueno, digamos, seguramente estarás de acuerdo conmigo, que uno puede aplicar los autores a las realidades. A mí, Lefort, como también Arendt, me sirven siempre mucho para pensar. Ahora, si efectivamente el fenómeno Milei, en el caso argentino, viniendo de décadas de gobiernos ineficientes, corruptos, que no han sabido controlar ninguna de las situaciones, ni económica ni social, puede simplemente pensarse en los términos de la incertidumbre democrática, de la insoportabilidad de la incertidumbre democrática, bueno, creo que la cuestión del fracaso de los gobiernos anteriores debe sumarse a la cuestión de la incertidumbre. Entonces, sin duda hay algo de hartazgo que tiene que ver con cuando, digamos, esta primera cita que yo hacía larga de Lefort, que decía, todos la conocemos, ¿no? Cuando el lugar vacío del poder aparece como un vacío de poder, cuando, etcétera, entonces se abren las posibilidades para que efectivamente haya una atracción muy fuerte por el uno. Sin duda hay algo de eso, pero yo creo que yo me quedaría corta en mi análisis si pensara que con Lefort puedo pensar todo aquello que hay que pensar en estos fenómenos.
Perfeito. Mais alguma questão? Não? Então, vamos encerrar por aqui. Professora, muito obrigado por ter aceito o nosso convite, muito obrigado pela sua conferência, foi um prazer imenso ouvi-la, e esperamos, né, talvez reencontrá-la em outros eventos aqui na UFMG. Muito obrigado pela sua disponibilidade.
Muchísimas gracias a ustedes nuevamente por la invitación y por la atención.
Obrigado.
Buenos días.